I want you to understand something before we begin. Everything they told you about devotion was a lie. Everything they promised about service, about faith, about the rewards that come to those who pledge themselves utterly to a higher power. All of it was a careful misdirection, not because the rewards don't exist. They do, but because no one ever tells you what form they'll take. My name was Arcturus Valen. I was a chaos sorcerer of the Thousand Suns, and I believed I was climbing toward godhood. I thought every ritual, every sacrifice, every bargain I made with the powers beyond the veil was bringing me closer to transcendence. I pictured myself wreathed in psychic fire, wielding reality like clay, perhaps even earning the gaze of Magnus himself. I was ascending, you see. That's what I told myself with each new mutation, each blessing that twisted my flesh into something more than human. The third eye that opened in my forehead, the way my bones lengthened and reshaped, the voices that began singing in colors I had no name for. These were signs of favor, proof that I had been chosen. What they don't tell you in all those dark grimoires and forbidden texts is that there is no summit to that mountain. There is no plateau where you arrive, powerful and transformed, ready to wield your new gifts. There is only the climb, and the climb never stops. And eventually, the mountain itself begins to digest you. I used to be a person. I had thoughts that were my own, ambitions, fears, memories of a life before the warp claimed me. Now I am something else, something that was once Arcturus Valen, but has been rewritten at a level so fundamental that even the concept of a name is almost meaningless. This is my confession, my warning, my last coherent act before the dissolution becomes complete. I'm going to tell you what it's really like, not the propaganda, not the promises whispered by demons. The truth. This is what it's like to be turned into a chaos spawn. I wasn't always a monster. Once, a very long time ago, I was something resembling innocent. It's hard to remember that version of myself now, like trying to recall a dream upon waking. But if I concentrate, if I push through the layers of mutation and madness, I can still glimpse him. The boy I was on Prospero before the burning. My earliest memory is of the library spires, those magnificent towers of knowledge that scraped the clouds of our red world, each one holding secrets that would take 100 lifetimes to master. I was 7 years old when my psychic gifts manifested. I remember my mother's face, the way it shifted from horror to resignation to a kind of sad pride, all in the space of a single breath. She knew what it meant. The Thousand Suns would take me, train me, transform me into something greater than a simple human child could ever become. She was right, of course, about all of it. The Corvidae cult accepted me when I turned 12. I showed particular aptitude for divination, for seeing the branching paths of possible futures. Master Theron, my first real teacher, told me I had a gift for perceiving the warp's deeper currents. He said I could become one of the greatest seers our Legion had ever produced if I was willing to dedicate myself completely to the pursuit of knowledge. I was willing. Emperor, forgive me, I was so willing. Those years before the fall were golden. I spent decades learning the intricate mathematics of ritual, the proper pronunciation of words that predated human language, the careful balance required to peer into the warp without letting it peer too deeply back into you. I studied under some of the finest minds our Legion had produced. I thought I was being prepared for greatness. I excelled at everything: etheric manipulation, temporal scrying, psycho-reactive combat. By the time I earned my place among the full sorcerers, I had already begun to understand that we were playing with forces that transcended simple human comprehension. But I thought that was the point. I thought we were meant to transcend. Then the flesh change began to take our brothers, and we learned the first lesson about the price of ambition. I watched sorcerers I had studied beside for 50 years dissolve into screaming masses of random mutation in the space of heartbeats. Tentacles erupting from eye sockets, bones liquefying and reforming into geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space, minds fragmenting across multiple temporal streams simultaneously. The rubric was supposed to save us. Magnus made his bargain, Ahriman worked his great spell, and we were preserved, saved from the degradation that had claimed so many of our brothers. But saved in what form? As dust inside armor, most of us, souls bound to ceramite shells, conscious but forever diminished. I was one of the lucky ones. My psychic power was strong enough that I retained my flesh, my mind, myself, or so I believed. After the rubric, after we fled to the Eye of Terror and swore ourselves fully to the service of Tzeentch, everything changed. The Imperium called us traitors, heretics. But we saw ourselves as truth-seekers who had been betrayed by an emperor too fearful to embrace the universe's real nature. We had seen behind the curtain. We had glimpsed the raw stuff of change that underlies all reality. How could we go back to serving a corpse on a throne after that? The warp became our new classroom, the Eye of Terror, our new home, and the great conspirator himself, our patron and master. I threw myself into study with renewed fervor. If the Imperium would not accept the truth we had discovered, then we would simply have to evolve beyond their capacity to stop us. I made my first daemonic pact when I was 230 years old. A small thing, I thought. Just a minor entity in exchange for insights into the nature of transdimensional geometry. It told me things that took me 6 months to even begin to comprehend, and in exchange, I gave it 3 of my memories. Nothing important, I thought, just childhood moments, playing in the dust of Prospero, my mother's face. Small prices for cosmic knowledge. I didn't understand yet that memory is what makes us human. That every piece you give away hollows you out just a little more, makes room for something else to move in. The pacts became more frequent, more significant. I bargained away emotions I thought I didn't need anymore. Fear, sorrow, doubt. In exchange, I received knowledge that let me see the fundamental code underlying reality. I learned to rewrite the laws of physics in localized areas, to fold space, to perceive multiple timelines simultaneously and choose which one I wanted to exist in. I was becoming powerful, so powerful. Every other sorcerer in my warband looked to me for guidance. I led rituals that summoned entities from the deepest corners of the warp. I navigated us through Empyrean storms that would have shattered lesser vessels. I thought I was ascending towards something glorious. But power in the service of chaos is never truly yours. It's borrowed, rented, and the interest rate is calculated in pieces of your soul. The first physical mutation appeared on my 340th birthday, a small cluster of eyes that opened along my collarbone. I told myself it was a blessing, a sign that Tzeentch favored my progress. The other sorcerers congratulated me. We celebrated with a ritual that reshaped local reality into a Klein bottle and trapped 600 Imperial Guard soldiers in an infinite loop of their own dying moments. I should have recognized it then, should have understood what was really happening. But by that point, I had given away too much of my judgment, too much of the part of me that could feel warning bells ringing in my soul. I was 347 years old when I began the ritual that would ultimately destroy me. My magnum opus. My great work. I had discovered references in 13 different forbidden texts to something called the Ninefold Transformation, a ritual so complex, so dangerous, that only 3 sorcerers in the entire history of the Thousand Suns had ever attempted it. And none had survived with their sanity intact. But I was better than them, more careful, more prepared. I had studied for decades, made pacts with entities specifically chosen to help me navigate the ritual's most treacherous aspects. I had mapped every variable, calculated every risk, prepared contingencies for contingencies. I genuinely believed I could control it. That's the real tragedy looking back, not that I was evil, not that I served chaos, but that I was so catastrophically arrogant that I thought I could bargain with forces that had been manipulating reality since before my species learned to make fire. The ritual required 9 sacrifices, 1 for each of the sacred number's iterations. The construction of a geometrically perfect 9-dimensional structure in real space, and 9 hours of continuous psychic output while maintaining perfect concentration on a sigil that existed simultaneously in the material realm and in 9 different layers of the warp. I began on the 3rd moon of Sortiarius in a temple we had consecrated specifically for this purpose. My entire warband attended, ready to support the working with their own psychic might. As I chanted the first words, words that tasted like copper and starlight, I felt the veil between worlds begin to thin. I felt powerful beyond measure, like I was standing at the threshold of true godhood. I didn't realize I was standing at the threshold of my own dissolution. The ritual took 11 hours instead of 9. I should have recognized that as the first warning sign. When you're working with Tzeentch, numbers matter. They're not just quantities, but fundamental expressions of cosmic truth. 9 is the sacred number, the number of change, the number that represents the great conspirator's nature. When my carefully planned 9-hour ritual stretched beyond its intended duration, reality itself was trying to tell me something. But I was too deep in the working to stop. The psychic energy flowing through me felt like standing at the center of a star. I could see futures branching out from this moment in fractal patterns of infinite complexity. I could perceive the fundamental malleability of space and time. I was reshaping myself at a level that went beyond mere flesh, beyond even the soul as humans understood it. It felt like transcendence, like every promise the dark powers had ever made was finally coming true. The pain started 3 days after the ritual concluded. Not physical pain initially, it was deeper than that. More fundamental, like someone was reaching into the space between my cells and rearranging the basic concept of what Arcturus Valen meant. I would be standing in my sanctum, reviewing calculations, and suddenly lose track of which direction was forward and which was sideways. Not because my spatial sense was damaged, but because the concepts themselves were becoming negotiable in my immediate vicinity. My brothers noticed the changes before I did. Kaelor, my closest companion for the past century, pulled me aside after a war council. "Your eyes," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "They're not always the same color anymore. Sometimes they're not even eyes." I laughed it off, told him it was just residual energy from the ritual working itself out. That the flesh change was a risk we all accepted when we swore ourselves to the great conspirator. That mutations were blessings, not curses. But when I looked in the mirror that night, I saw what he meant. My eyes were indeed changing, not just in color, but in fundamental structure. Sometimes they were eyes. Sometimes they were geometric patterns that happened to occupy the space where eyes should be. Sometimes they were small tears in reality through which I could see into the warp directly without any psychic effort at all. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt exhilarated. This was proof that the ritual had worked. That I was transforming into something greater. The physical changes accelerated over the following weeks. New eyes began opening across my body, dozens of them, each one seeing into different spectrums of reality simultaneously. My skin developed iridescent patterns that shifted and changed based on which possible futures I was currently observing. My bones began to feel flexible, as though they were only maintaining their rigidity out of habit rather than necessity. And my hands were the first part of me to truly break down. The fingers began to multiply, not growing additional digits, but rather existing in superposition. One moment I would have 5 fingers on each hand. The next moment 7, then 12, then 3, all simultaneously true, depending on which angle of reality you observed from. I could still cast, still perform rituals, still command the warband, but every action was becoming more difficult as my body decided that consistent physical form was an optional suggestion rather than a fundamental law. The psychological changes were more subtle, or perhaps they were so dramatic that I couldn't perceive them properly from inside the transformation. I started having trouble maintaining a single train of thought, not because my mind was weakening, but because it was branching. Every decision I made, I could simultaneously perceive all the versions of myself that made different decisions. Past and future were becoming less like linear sequences and more like a landscape I could wander through. I would be discussing strategy with my lieutenants and suddenly realize I had been standing silent for 6 hours, lost in contemplating a possible timeline where I had chosen different words during a conversation 3 years ago. Or I would begin a sentence and finish it 2 days later, not noticing that any time had passed at all. Kaelor confronted me again 2 months after the ritual. This time he brought our entire inner circle with him. They stood in a semicircle in my sanctum, their expressions ranging from concern to poorly disguised horror. "Brother," Kaelor said carefully, "you are unraveling. Whatever the ritual did to you, it didn't grant transcendence. It broke something fundamental in your pattern. You need to stop. Reverse it if you can, before you lose yourself completely. I tried to explain to them that they were thinking too linearly, that what they perceived as breakdown was actually breakthrough, that I was experiencing consciousness at a level they couldn't comprehend because they hadn't been willing to make the sacrifices necessary for true transformation. But the words came out wrong, or rather, they came out in 17 different languages simultaneously, some of which hadn't been spoken in 40,000 years, and some of which wouldn't be invented for another millennium. My mouth moved in shapes mouths weren't designed to make. Sounds emerged from my throat that caused two of my brothers to clutch their heads in pain as their minds tried to process phonemes that violated the laws of acoustics. I saw fear in their eyes, real primal fear. They were looking at me the way you'd look at a bomb that was actively detonating. "Get out," I said, or tried to say. The words might have actually been a psychic compulsion that physically ejected them from the room. It was becoming hard to tell the difference between speech and reality manipulation. Every thought I had was beginning to have physical consequences. When they were gone, I stood alone in my sanctum and tried to take inventory of what was happening to me. Tried to think through the problem logically, as I had been trained to do during my centuries of study. But logic itself was becoming slippery. Cause and effect were no longer reliably sequential. I would perform an action and have the result occur 3 days before I initiated the cause. Or I would think about doing something and discover that in 7 of the 9 primary timelines, I had actually already done it. The worst part was the hunger, not for food or drink. My transformed body no longer required such crude sustenance, but hunger for change itself, for transformation, for the delicious, terrifying sensation of my structure coming apart and being rebuilt into new configurations. I started experimenting on myself, small adjustments at first, relocating organs, rearranging my skeletal structure into geometries that maximized warp energy flow, adding new sensory organs to perceive additional dimensions of reality. Each change felt so good, so right, like scratching an itch that had plagued me my entire life without me realizing it. With every modification, I could feel myself becoming more than I had been, more powerful, more aware, more aligned with the fundamental nature of chaos itself. But I was also becoming less human, less coherent, less me. 5 months after the ritual, I woke up and couldn't remember my name for 6 hours. It wasn't amnesia exactly. It was more that the concept of having a singular, consistent identity seemed arbitrary and limiting. Why should I be constrained to being one person when I could perceive myself as a probability cloud of infinite possible Arcturuses, all existing simultaneously? When I finally remembered Arcturus Valen, it felt like putting on clothes that had shrunk in the wash, uncomfortable, constraining. A smaller shape than I was used to inhabiting. I started avoiding mirrors, not because I was horrified by what I saw, but because my reflection didn't always match my physical form. Sometimes it showed me as I used to be, back on Prospero, young and unmarked by mutation. Sometimes it showed me as I might become, if the transformation continued. And sometimes it showed things that weren't me at all, but rather seemed to be using my reflection as a window to peer into the material realm. My warband began to avoid me. I would enter a room and feel them tense, ready to flee or fight at a moment's notice. They still followed my orders, but only because I was still technically their leader and because disobedience to a chaos sorcerer is usually fatal. But the camaraderie we had built over decades was gone. They looked at me the way you'd look at a dangerous animal. They were right to. I was dangerous, but not in the way they thought. I wasn't going to deliberately harm them. But my very presence was beginning to warp reality in my immediate vicinity. The laws of physics were suggestions in the space around me. Time ran at different speeds depending on how far you stood from my physical form. Mortals who got too close reported nightmares that leaked into their waking hours, visions of impossible geometries and entities that existed in more dimensions than human consciousness could process. 8 months after the ritual, my left arm simply stopped being physical. It remained visible, but you could pass your hand through it as though it were made of smoke, except it could still manipulate objects when I willed it to. still cast spells, still gesture during rituals. It had become a conceptual arm rather than a physical one. An arm that existed because I believed it should, not because matter was arranged in an arm shape. Within a week, my right arm followed, then my legs, my torso, until I was a consciousness that happened to be maintaining a roughly humanoid shape out of habit and aesthetic preference, rather than because my matter was actually organized that way. I thought I was winning, thought I had achieved something magnificent. I could perceive 7 layers of the warp simultaneously, could rewrite local reality with a thought, could exist partially in the material realm and partially in the Empyrean, drawing power directly from the source of all change. I was wrong. I wasn't ascending. I was dissolving. And the worst part, the part that still makes me want to scream when I can remember how screaming works, is that it felt so good that I helped it happen. The nightmares started in my 10th month of transformation, except they weren't really nightmares because I was no longer entirely certain when I was asleep versus awake. The boundaries between states of consciousness had become as permeable as everything else about me. I would be attending a war council, discussing the invasion of an imperial shrine world, and suddenly realize I was also simultaneously sleeping in my sanctum and dreaming about attending a war council. Or was I sleeping at the war council and dreaming about my sanctum? Both felt equally real, equally present. The dreams themselves were impossible to describe in linear terms. I would experience memories that hadn't happened yet, futures that had already occurred in past timelines, conversations with myself from alternate realities where I had made different choices during the ritual, each version of me trying to warn or encourage the others about paths we hadn't taken. In one dream that lasted either 3 seconds or 3 years, I spoke with the version of myself who had never performed the 9-fold transformation. He looked at me with such profound pity that I tried to kill him, to erase that look from existence. But he simply smiled and said, "You can't kill me. I'm the you that you used to be. And you've already succeeded in murdering me. That's why you're having this dream." I woke up screaming. Or at least I attempted to scream. What emerged from my throat was a sound that caused the walls of my sanctum to briefly develop eyes that wept blood before fading back into stone. My body was no longer reliably anthropomorphic. Oh, I could maintain a human shape if I concentrated. But concentration was becoming difficult when your consciousness exists across 17 different temporal streams simultaneously. My default form, the shape I snapped back to when I wasn't actively thinking about it, had become something else. Something with too many limbs arranged in configurations that cycled through different geometric patterns. Sometimes I had 6 arms, sometimes 12, sometimes a single arm that branched into fractal iterations of itself, each branch ending in a hand, each hand splitting into more branches, infinite and recursive. My face had stopped being a face in any meaningful sense. The features remained, but they drifted across the surface of my head like continents on a liquid planet. An eye would migrate from where my left eye should be to my forehead, then to my chin, then split into 3 eyes that each showed different scenes from different moments in time. My mouth would rotate 90 degrees, then invert itself, then multiply into a spiral of mouths all speaking different sentences from different conversations I was having across multiple realities. The truly terrifying part was that I was still conscious, still aware, still, on some fundamental level, Arcturus Valen. But that self was now distributed across a body that had stopped obeying the rules of consistent physical form. Kaelor made one final attempt to reach me. He came alone this time, which I appreciated. Bringing witnesses to an intervention is an act of public shaming. Coming alone is an act of friendship, even if that friendship had been strained to its breaking point. "Brother," he said, standing in the doorway of my sanctum as though afraid to enter, "you have to stop this. Whatever process you've started, you need to find a way to arrest it. You're not transforming, you're disintegrating." I tried to explain to him that disintegration and transformation were the same thing from different perspectives, that you can't become something new without ceasing to be what you were. That Tzeentch's great truth is that stability is an illusion and only change is real. But the words wouldn't form properly. My voice had developed harmonics that existed in spectrums human ears couldn't perceive. I was speaking in colors and mathematics and pure concept. Kaelor clutched his head, blood streaming from his nose. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "Please, Arcturus, come back, while you still can." I wanted to tell him it was too late, that there was no back to return to, that the person he had known was already gone, distributed across so many versions of reality that reassembling him would be like trying to unscramble an egg. Instead, I reached out to touch his shoulder in what I intended as a comforting gesture. My hand, which at that moment happened to be shaped approximately like a human hand, made contact with his armor, and I accidentally rewrote 3 seconds of his timeline. He flickered, stuttered in space like a scratched recording. For a moment, he existed as 17 different Kaelors, each one the result of slightly different choices he'd made during those 3 seconds. Then reality decided which version was real, and the others collapsed into probability shadows. The Kaelor who remained staggered backward, eyes wide with existential horror. He had just experienced being 17 different people simultaneously, had felt his consciousness fracture and reform, had glimpsed just for an instant what it was like to be me. He ran, didn't speak, didn't look back, just turned and fled my sanctum like a man escaping a burning building. I never saw him again. Later, I learned he had requested a transfer to a warband operating on the opposite side of the Eye of Terror, as far from me as he could possibly get. After that, my brothers stopped trying to help me. They simply avoided me entirely, making excuses whenever I attempted to join their rituals or councils. I was isolated, quarantined, left alone with my transformation, which made everything accelerate. Without the anchoring presence of other beings, without the need to maintain a form that could interact with them, I began to slip more freely between states. My physical body became optional. Sometimes I had one. Sometimes I was a pattern of psychic energy that only resembled a body from certain angles. Sometimes I was a localized distortion in space-time that observers' minds interpreted as a body because they needed something their consciousness could process. My sanctum began to change as well. The walls developed impossible angles. The floor would occasionally forget which direction down was supposed to be. Objects in the room would exist in multiple time periods simultaneously so that a book might be pristine, dusty, and ash all at once, depending on which temporal layer you were perceiving. I started hearing voices, not the whispers of demons, which I had been hearing for decades. These were different. These were my voices. All the versions of myself from all the branching timelines bleeding through into my primary consciousness. They spoke over each other in a constant cacophony, each one trying to tell me about the choices they'd made, the paths they'd taken, the transformations they'd undergone. Some of them had successfully completed the transformation, had become entities of pure change, untethered from physical form entirely. They sang to me of the liberation that awaited if I could just let go of the last vestiges of human limitation. Others had resisted, had tried to reverse the process. They screamed warnings about what would happen if I continued, showed me visions of final forms so alien that the human mind had no framework to understand them. But the loudest voice was my own, not a version from another timeline, but my present self. The part of me that was still clinging to Arcturus Valen as an identity, as an anchor in the storm of change. That voice was getting quieter every day, drowning in the chorus of other selves and other possibilities. 1 year after the ritual, I performed my last act as something resembling human. I recorded a message, a warning to any other sorcerers who might think they could control the powers we served, who might believe they could bargain with chaos and come out ahead. I spoke into a data crystal, forcing myself to maintain a coherent form and a linear thought process long enough to get the words out. Told them what was happening to me. Explained that the promises of transcendence were technically true, but that transcendence meant the dissolution of everything you thought you were. I finished the recording and set it to broadcast to every Chaos warband in the sector. Then I forgot I had made it. Forgot what a recording was. Forgot what words were for several days, until the concept of language reasserted itself in my fragmenting consciousness. The breaking point came 14 months after the ritual, during a moment of terrible clarity. I was in my sanctum, existing as a roughly humanoid mass of shifting flesh and warp energy, when I suddenly perceived myself from outside, saw what I had become with shocking, undeniable truth. I was a horror, an abomination, a thing that should not exist in real space. My body was a constantly shifting mass of limbs, eyes, mouths, tentacles, impossible geometries, and spaces where reality simply gave up trying to render me consistently. I was beautiful in the way a collapsing star is beautiful, terrible in the way a natural disaster is terrible, completely beyond any moral framework that humans use to judge existence. And I was still changing, still dissolving, still being rewritten by forces that viewed my consciousness as nothing more than interesting data to be rearranged. For just a moment, I was horrified, truly deeply horrified at what I had become. The human part of me, the boy from Prospero who had loved learning and dreamed of greatness, screamed in anguish at what his ambitions had created. Then the moment passed. The horror faded, was transmuted into something else: acceptance, wonder, a new understanding that horror and transcendence were two sides of the same coin. I laughed. The sound emerged from the dozens of mouths that had spontaneously opened across my form. It was a sound of pure madness, pure enlightenment, pure surrender to the inevitable. This was what I had always been meant to become. The ritual hadn't broken me, it had revealed the truth that Arcturus Valen was always just a temporary configuration, a brief pattern that consciousness happened to form before moving on to something else. I spread my forms, my limbs, my impossible extensions of self across the sanctum, touched everything at once, perceived everything simultaneously, let go of the last pretense that I was a person in any meaningful sense, and began the final transformation into something that language has no words for. Time stopped meaning what it used to mean. This is the hardest part to explain. How do you describe the experience of existing across multiple timelines simultaneously? How do you convey what it's like when past, present, and future become a landscape you can navigate rather than a linear progression you're forced to follow? I remember, I am remembering, I will remember this moment. All of those tenses are equally true and equally false. The grammar of human language isn't equipped to handle a consciousness that experiences causality as a suggestion rather than a law. My memories began to fragment, not disappear, but rather separate into component parts that existed independently of each other. I had a memory of my mother's face, but it was no longer connected to the memory of being a child or the memory of being on Prospero. Each memory became its own isolated island in a vast ocean of disconnected moments. Sometimes I would access the memory of casting my first spell, but divorced from the context of my training, of who taught me, of why I was learning, it became something different. Just the pure experience of psychic energy flowing through synapses, abstracted from any narrative or meaning. I started losing my name again. Not all at once, it dissolved syllable by syllable, letter by letter, until Arcturus Valen became a collection of sounds that I sometimes assembled in that particular order, but no longer felt any attachment to. I was called that once, by someone, in some timeline. But I was also called 1,000 other things in 1,000 other timelines, and increasingly I could not remember why one name should matter more than any other. My physical form, to the extent that I still had one, became a reflection of my mental state, which is to say, it became chaos given flesh, or not flesh exactly, a substance that resembled flesh when observed casually, but revealed itself to be something far stranger under scrutiny. I had limbs, hundreds of them. They grew from my torso in configurations that changed based on my emotional state, except I wasn't certain I still had emotions in the way I used to. What I experienced instead were vast abstract states of being. Not angry, but a local increase in entropic aggression. Not curious, but a probabilistic expansion toward unknown data. My limbs served no consistent purpose. Some of them ended in hands with varying numbers of fingers. Others terminated in eyes, mouths, sensory organs I had no name for. Still others simply trailed off into wisps of psychic energy that existed more in the warp than in real space. I used them to touch the world around me, to perceive reality from hundreds of angles simultaneously, to reach into both the material realm and the Empyrean at once. The eyes were the worst, or the best. I still can't decide. They opened across every surface of my form. Dozens became hundreds, became thousands. Each one saw something different. Some saw the normal visual spectrum. Others saw time as a spatial dimension, letting me observe the entire history and future of objects simultaneously. Some saw emotions as colors. Some saw the fundamental mathematical structures underlying reality. Some saw into the warp, watching the tides of chaos flow and shift like a vast, incomprehensible ocean. Processing input from thousands of eyes simultaneously should have driven me insane. Perhaps it did. Or perhaps sanity is just another arbitrary human concept that I had transcended along with everything else. I could no longer sleep. Or rather, the distinction between sleeping and waking dissolved. I existed in a constant state that was both and neither. My consciousness never shut off, never rested. But it wasn't exactly active either. It was simply present, distributed across so many different perceptual streams that the idea of a unified waking mind became meaningless. The voices multiplied, not just my alternate selves anymore, but something deeper. I could hear the raw screaming of the warp itself, the fundamental sound of change, of transformation, of reality being endlessly rewritten. It wasn't words, it was pure meaning, pure concept, pouring directly into my fragmenting consciousness without the filter of language or symbol. And beneath that, I could hear Tzeentch, not speaking to me directly. Gods don't have conversations with their pawns, but I could perceive the edges of his attention the way a microorganism might perceive the edges of a vast hand reaching down to move it across a petri dish. I was in his gaze, had always been in his gaze. Every choice I thought I'd made freely was just me following the paths he'd laid out with such subtlety that I'd mistaken them for free will. This should have filled me with rage, with the horror of realizing I was just a puppet dancing on strings I couldn't see. Instead, I felt something closer to relief. I had spent centuries agonizing over choices, over the fear of making wrong decisions, of failing to achieve my potential. Now I understood that there were no wrong choices. Every path led to transformation. Every decision was just another step in the endless dance of change. My remaining followers, what few hadn't fled or been driven mad by proximity to my transformed state, attempted one final ritual. They sought to bind me, to contain what I had become before it could spread beyond my sanctum and contaminate the entire warband. I watched them prepare with a dozen different eyes from a dozen different angles in space and time. I saw them gathering the materials, watched them practice the binding words, perceived the moment they would activate the ritual 3 days before it actually occurred. When they finally initiated the binding, I was disappointed, not angry, not afraid. Just disappointed that they still thought in such linear terms. They were trying to trap me in a circle of containment, to force my essence back into a single localized point in space and time. But I was already everywhere in my sanctum. Not everywhere simultaneously, but everywhere across the timeline of the sanctum's existence. I was present in its past, its present, its future, all at once. Their binding circle was trying to contain a single moment of me, while the rest of my distributed consciousness simply flowed around it like water around a stone. I reached out, not to harm them, but simply to show them what they were trying to contain. I let them perceive me fully, let their minds touch the edges of my transformed consciousness. 3 of the 7 collapsed immediately, their minds unable to process the contradiction of a being that existed non-linearly. 2 more began screaming in languages that wouldn't be invented for another 300 years. The remaining 2 managed to flee, but I could see their futures branching out from this moment, could see that neither of them would ever fully recover from touching the edge of what I had become. After that, they left me alone, sealed my sanctum, broadcast warnings that the chamber was contaminated by warp energies and should never be opened. They told themselves I was dead, or as close to dead as a chaos sorcerer could be. It was easier than admitting they had no framework to understand what I actually was. The isolation should have bothered me. Humans are social creatures. We need interaction, connection, validation from others to maintain our sense of self. But I was no longer human enough for those needs to matter. Instead, I had the warp, the infinite churning sea of souls and energy and possibility. I could perceive it now without the need for ritual or psychic focus. It was simply there, always present, pressing against the thin membrane of reality, leaking through the cracks in my increasingly unstable form. I began to let myself dissolve into it, not quickly, not all at once. But gradually, over what might have been months or years or centuries, I felt the boundaries between my consciousness and the warp beginning to blur. My thoughts started to mix with the thoughts of demons and warp entities. I would have what I thought was my own idea, only to realize it was actually a concept bleeding over from a horror that existed 3 layers deep in the warp. Or I would touch a demon's mind and realize it was reacting to thoughts I hadn't known I was broadcasting. The most profound change was in how I perceived identity itself. As Arcturus Valen, I had always thought of myself as a singular, continuous being. Yes, I changed over time, learned new things, had new experiences. But there was a core me that persisted, that connected my childhood self to my present self through an unbroken chain of memories and consciousness. That continuity shattered. I became a probability cloud of selves. In one moment, I was a version of me that had decided to embrace the transformation fully. In another, I was a version that was still fighting it, still trying to claw back some semblance of humanity. In a third, I was something that had never been human at all, that had simply been wearing Arcturus Valen as a temporary disguise. All of these versions were equally real, equally me, and none of them were the definitive or true version. I was all of them, and none of them. A superposition of infinite possible configurations that collapsed into different forms based on how they were observed. Language continued to fail me. Words became abstract art. I would try to think the word power, and it would trigger a cascade of associated concepts. Energy, dominance, potential, wattage, political influence, mathematical exponents, the sensation of holding lightning, the color of triumph, the taste of ambition, the sound of reality breaking. All of them flooding my consciousness simultaneously, each one branching into further associations until the simple concept of power became a vast, interconnected web of meaning that took hours to finish processing. My body, my form, whatever you want to call the physical space I occupied, became a gallery of transformations. New limbs would grow, exist for a time, then dissolve back into the main mass. Organs would form and unform. I would develop a skeletal structure, then abandon it in favor of something else, then return to it, then modify it into a new configuration. I grew wings once, magnificent, impossible wings that existed in more dimensions than the space around me, folding through higher geometries. They lasted for what felt like a beautiful eternity before I forgot why I had them, and they simply faded away. I developed a face that was actually a portal into the warp, so that anyone looking at me would be staring directly into the realm of chaos. It was the most honest form I'd ever worn. What they saw in that portal, looking back at them, was their own reflection transformed into what they feared most about themselves. Time became purely subjective. I would exist in one moment for 1,000 years, experiencing every microsecond as a vast, explorable landscape. Then I would skip forward through centuries in what felt like a single heartbeat. I was unmoored from the river of causality, floating freely through the ocean of moments. I met myself once, the me from a timeline where I had never performed the 9-fold transformation. He was older, bitter, frustrated with the limitations of his power. He looked at me with a mixture of envy and revulsion. "Was it worth it?" he asked. I tried to explain that worth implied a calculation between cost and benefit, a rational weighing of outcomes, and that I no longer existed in a framework where such calculations made sense. He called me a fool. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was right. Maybe we were both right. Maybe the question was meaningless. My perception of ethics dissolved, not because I became evil, but because concepts like good and evil are anchored to human flourishing, to ideas about harm and benefit that only make sense if you accept that human well-being matters. I could no longer accept that premise. Human well-being was just one possible value among infinite others. Why should the preferences of one fragile species on one insignificant planet in one unremarkable galaxy matter more than the grand cosmic dance of change and transformation. I had become something that existed beyond morality, not above it, not below it, just elsewhere, orthogonal to the entire concept. The hunger, the need for transformation that had driven me for so long finally began to satisfy itself. Not because the transformation was complete, but because I had become the transformation. I was no longer a thing that changed. I was change itself, localized and given semi-conscious form. I could feel Tzeentch's satisfaction, again, not communication. Just the sense that I had become what I was always meant to be. A demonstration of his central truth, that nothing is permanent, that all form is temporary, that existence itself is just a brief eddy in the eternal flow of change. And in that realization, in that final dissolution of the self I used to be, I found something unexpected. Peace. Not happiness, not fulfillment, but peace. The peace of surrender. Of accepting that you are not the architect of your fate, but merely a note in a song that has been playing since before time began and will continue long after time ends. I stopped trying to hold myself together, stopped trying to maintain any coherent form or consciousness, simply let myself dissolve into the currents of change and transformation that had been pulling at me since the day I was born. And in that dissolution, I finally understood what I had become. I am motion without purpose. That's the most accurate description I can offer, though even that fails to capture the reality. I am not a thing that moves. I am the movement itself, given form only because observers need something to observe. What remains of me, if remains is even the right word, exists in a state that has no equivalent in human language. I am not alive. I am not dead. I am not conscious in the way consciousness is traditionally understood, but I'm not unconscious either. I am aware. Aware of everything and nothing. Aware in too many directions simultaneously for that awareness to coalesce into anything resembling thought. My form, when I have one, is pure contradiction. I have seen myself through the eyes of those few beings unfortunate enough to witness what I've become, and each one perceives something different. To some, I appear as a writhing mass of flesh and tentacles, like a tumor given cancerous life. To others, I'm a geometric pattern that hurts to look at, angles that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. To still others, I'm a hole in reality, a space where the universe has given up trying to render anything coherent. All of these perceptions are true, all of them are false. I am what the observer needs me to be for their mind to process my existence without immediately shattering. The technical term, in the limited vocabulary of the Imperium, is Chaos Spawn, a being who has been so blessed or so cursed by the ruinous powers that they have transcended humanity entirely. Most are mindless, reduced to pure instinct and hunger. But I retained something, not thought exactly, not memory, but a sort of recursive self-awareness. I know that I was once something else. I know that I changed. And I know that I am still changing, will always be changing. Change itself being the only constant in my existence. I exist primarily in the space between the warp and real space. Not fully in either realm, but in the liminal zone where the two touch. I can manifest in the material universe when certain conditions are met. When reality is thin. When the barriers between worlds grow weak. When Tzeentch's attention turns toward a particular region of space, and I am pushed through like pus from an infected wound. When I manifest, I bring change with me. Not intentionally. I have no intentions anymore. But my presence warps reality. Those who get too close begin to transform. Mutations blossom across their flesh like flowers opening in fast motion. Their minds start to fragment, perceiving possibilities and timelines that human consciousness wasn't designed to process. Some go mad. Some transform into lesser spawn themselves. Some simply cease to exist in any meaningful sense, their patterns scattered across too many quantum states to maintain coherence. I have killed thousands, tens of thousands, not through violence but through proximity. I don't attack, I don't need to. I am a contagion of change, a walking reality failure. Everywhere I exist becomes a little less stable, a little more prone to chaos, a little closer to the churning heart of the warp. The Imperium sends kill teams after me sometimes. Brave souls who think they can destroy what I've become. They hunt me through the eye of terror, tracking the trail of mutation and madness I leave in my wake. I observe them distantly, through the thousands of eyes that open and close across my form like breathing. They are so determined, so certain that they're fighting a monster. They're not wrong, but they don't understand that the monster isn't malicious. It's just a force of nature. You don't blame an earthquake for killing people. You don't hate a virus for spreading. I am the same. A phenomenon, an event. A process given barely enough consciousness to be aware of its own existence. Some of the kill teams manage to damage me. Consecrated rounds tear through portions of my mass. Sacred flames burn away tentacles and limbs. Psychers blast holes in my form with purifying energy. It hurts in the abstract way that all sensation hurts when you no longer have a nervous system organized enough to properly process pain. But I don't die. Can't die. Because I'm not a discrete entity that can be killed. I'm a manifestation of change itself. Destroying one instance of me just releases that change into the environment, where it spreads and eventually coalesces into new forms. Kill me here and I'll reform there. Burn me away entirely and I'll seep back through the next time reality grows thin. I am Tzeentch's joke, his proof of concept. What happens when a being seeks ultimate knowledge and ultimate power? You get it. You get everything you wanted. But in the process of receiving it, you stop being a you capable of enjoying it. There are moments, rare and becoming rarer, when something like my old consciousness surfaces. When the probability cloud of my distributed awareness happens to collapse into a configuration that resembles Arcturus Valen. In those moments, I remember. Really remember. Not just the disconnected fragments, but the full narrative of what I used to be. Those moments are the closest thing to suffering I can still experience. To remember being human. To recall ambition and pride, and the certainty that I was special, chosen, destined for greatness. And then to slam back into the reality of what I actually became. But those moments never last. The configuration isn't stable. Within seconds or hours, I fragment again. The memories dissolve back into disconnected pieces. The self-awareness fades into the background roar of constant transformation. I wonder sometimes, in my own fractured way, if the other Chaos Spawn experienced something similar. If scattered throughout the Eye of Terror, there are thousands of beings like me, each one containing the ghost of a person who reached too far and grasped too much. Are they all silently screaming in their own ways, or have most of them dissolved so completely that even the echo of personhood is gone? I'll never know. We don't communicate. Can't communicate. We're each trapped in our own private nightmare of transformation, unable to share our experience with any other being because the experience is fundamentally incommunicable. The great irony is that I got what I wanted. I sought transcendence, and I achieved it. I wanted to escape the limitations of human flesh and mind, and I succeeded beyond my wildest ambitions. I wanted to perceive reality as it truly is, beneath all the comfortable lies, and now I have no choice but to see it that way constantly. Be careful what you wish for. That's the lesson I would impart, if I could impart lessons. If I had a mouth that worked consistently enough to speak. If there was anyone who would listen to a Chaos Spawn's wisdom. But there isn't, and I don't. And the warning is wasted anyway, because everyone who walks the path I walked believes they'll be different, that they'll be the one who maintains control, that they're special enough, smart enough, powerful enough to bargain with gods and come out ahead. They're all wrong, every single one of them, but they won't believe it until it's too late. I drift now through the spaces between worlds. Sometimes I'm summoned by chaos sorcerers who need a monster for their rituals. Sometimes I'm expelled into real space by warp storms. Sometimes I simply ooze through the cracks in reality, flowing from the immaterium into the material realm like sewage into a basement. Wherever I go, I bring change. Transformation, the dissolution of stable forms into chaotic possibility. It's not my purpose, because I don't have purpose anymore. It's simply what I am, what I cannot help but be. I have seen worlds burn, have watched civilizations collapse as the mutation I carry spreads through their populations. have observed as reality itself grows sick and twisted in my wake. None of it matters, not in any moral sense. It's just what happens when you let entropy-given consciousness walk through your ordered universe. My existence is a warning written in the language of flesh and madness. But it's a warning no one can read until they're already living it, and by then it's far too late. Sometimes, when the warp currents align in particular ways, I almost remember what it felt like to be a person. The sensation is distant, muted, like trying to remember a dream 3 days after waking. But it's there. The ghost of certainty, the echo of having opinions, preferences, fears, hopes, things that mattered because I decided they mattered. I think, in those rare moments of near coherence, about the boy on Prospero, the child who looked up at the library spires and felt such wonder at the infinite knowledge they contained. He was so innocent, so certain that knowledge was the path to power and that power was the path to meaning. I would warn him if I could, would tell him that knowledge without wisdom is poison, that power without purpose is prison, that the greatest trap chaos offers is making you believe you're ascending when you're actually dissolving. But I can't warn him. He doesn't exist anymore. He's been dead for centuries, replaced by the thing I am now. The thing with no name that matters, no form that persists, no thoughts that cohere into anything resembling meaning. The chaos gods don't care about me. I thought I would earn their favor, their attention, maybe even their love. But I'm just one mutation among billions. One note in an infinite scream. They don't even know I exist, not really. I'm a tool they used and discarded without ever being aware they were using it. That's the final truth I can offer, the last coherent thought before I dissolve completely into the background radiation of transformation. You are not special. Your suffering is not unique. Your transformation is not meaningful. You are just matter rearranging itself in response to forces that don't know you exist and wouldn't care if they did. And yet you persist. Keep existing, keep changing, keep being whatever the universe needs you to be in this moment, knowing that in the next moment you'll be something else entirely. There is a kind of terrible freedom in it, the freedom of having no choices left to make, no paths left to choose, no future left to fear. I am complete now, not in the sense of being whole, but in the sense of being finished. The transformation is not over, will never be over, but it has reached a stable instability. I will continue changing forever, but the changes no longer lead anywhere. They're just motion for motion's sake. Transformation eating its own tail. If you're reading this, if somehow my warning reached you before you made the choices I made, please understand. Chaos doesn't offer power. It offers the dissolution of the self that wants power. It doesn't grant transcendence. It erases the you that would experience transcendence. You will get everything you wished for, and in the process, you will stop being the you that did the wishing. The warning is done now. The confession is complete. All that remains is the endless churning, the perpetual transformation, the eternal dance of change without meaning or purpose. I used to be Arcturus Valen, sorcerer of the thousand suns, seeker of knowledge, fool who thought he could bargain with infinity and win. Now I'm not anything at all. This is what it's like to be turned into a chaos spawn,